Okay, today we're going to look at graphs of cosine functions, and I'm also going to do some examples of vertical shifts. Now, looking at our unit circle, we're going to look at the quadrant angles again: 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. But now we're looking at cosine of those angles. And remember, cosine represents the x-coordinates. So it goes 1, 0, -1, 0, and back at 1. That represents a typical period for cosine. So what I'm going to do is show you the graph of y equals cosine of x. 1 is still the maximum, -1 is the minimum. And if you notice, I'm still going to have 5 tick marks per graph. So that didn't change from the sine graph. What's going to change is the shape of cosine. So if you look at 0, we start at our maximum. Then we go back to 0. Then we go to our minimum. Then we go back to 0. And then we go back to our maximum. So the graph wave looks a little bit different. It's kind of like a U shape. But that wave continues throughout your period. So you can either go to the left or the right. So that's the shape of your cosine graph. Now your characteristics are still the same. So for each graph, you still have to do let me type it. So for your characteristics, they're the same as sine. So you still have to do your amplitude, which is the absolute value of A. Your period is still 2 pi over b. Your phase shift is still x equals c over b. That's still your starting point. Your vertical shift is still y equals d. And you still need 5 quarter points. So you're going to take your period and you divide it by 4 to get your tick marks, and you add that to your starting point. Let's try one. Here's our first graph, y equals 3 cosine of x. We're going to do similar to what we did with the sine graph. Identify A, which is 3. B is the number in front of x, which is 1. C is always in parentheses. We don't have any, so it's 0. And D is 0. Then I'm going to do my amplitude, which is the absolute value of 3, which equals 3. My period, which is 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi. My phase shift, which I'm abbreviating, that's x equals c over b, which is 0. And my vertical shift is y equals d, which is 0. So I make my graph. 3 is my max, -3 my min, 0 is my starting point. To get your tick marks, remember you take your period and we're dividing it into fourths. We're adding 1 pi over 2, starting at 0. So 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which is pi, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. And then we start our curve, or our wave. Remember, cosine starts at your max, then 0, then your min, then 0, then back at your max. And there's your curve. Let's see what happens when we have a negative. So we're doing y equals negative 2 cosine x. So now a is negative 2, b is 1, c is 0, d is still 0. So my amp, I'm going to abbreviate it now. Absolute value of negative 2, which is 2. My period, 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi. My phase shift, x equals c over b, which is 0. My vertical shift is y equals d, which is also 0. My starting point is 0. Max is 2. Min is negative 2. Take your period, we're divided into fourths. Just like the previous example, we're adding 1 pi over 2. So that's 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. Here's the difference. A is negative, so now you start at your min, 0, max, 0, min. So you're going to see that this wave has been reflected over the x-axis. And that represents one period. In this example, A is 5, B is everything in front of x, which is 2 pi, C is 0, and D is 0. So my amp is the absolute value of 5, which is 5. My period is 2 pi over B. 2 pi over 2 pi, which is 1. My phase shift is x equals c over b, which is still 0. And my vertical shift is y equals d, which is 0. Five is my max. Negative 5 is my min, starting at 0. I'm going to take my period and divide it into fourths. So that means we're adding 1/4 each time. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So if you notice, your period is 1 unit long. Divide into fourths. So to do the graph, start at your max, 0, min, 0, max. And there's your curve. Now let's try one with the phase shift. We'll do y equals 3. Cosine 2 pi x plus 4 pi. So A is 3. B is everything in front of x, which is 2 pi. C, don't forget C is opposite, so it's negative 4 pi. D would be plus or minus what's outside of those parentheses, but there's nothing there. So my amp is absolute value of 3, which is 3. My period is like the previous example, 2 pi over 2 pi, which is 1. My phase shift is x equals C over B, which equals negative 2. So that's your new starting point. And my vertical shift is y equals 0. To get your tick marks, you're going to take your period and you're dividing it by 4. So since we're starting at negative 2, and we're only adding a fourth each time, I'm going to start my graph to the left of my y-axis. So negative 2, remember, is negative 8/4. And that would be adding 1/4, negative 7/4. Negative 6/4 would be negative 3 over 2. Negative 5/4. And negative 1 would be negative 4/4. So your max is 3. Your min is negative 3. So you still start at your max, 0, min, 0, max. And there's your cosine curve. Okay, I want to do an example of some vertical shifts because we haven't had any so far. Since we're on cosine, I'll do one of cosine. And then I'll do one of sine. Okay, I still identify A, which is 1. B is 1. C, you have to remember, is always in parentheses. D is now negative 3. Which means we're going to take our graph after we graph it and move it down 3. So my amp is absolute value 1, which is 1. My period is 2 pi over B, which is 2 pi. My phase shift is x equals C over B, which is 0. And my vertical shift is y equals negative 3. And you still take your period. And you divide it by 4, which is 1 pi over 2. So we're starting at 0, and I'm doing 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. Now, when we start the cosine, remember we would start at our max, 0, min, 0, and back at your max. When there is a phase shift, that means that you move each point down 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. And then there's your curve. So what that means is at negative, y equals -3, that's your new 0. That's like your midline. So that each wave is still 1 unit high. So that's what happens when you have a vertical shift. And then I'll do it for sine. And I'm going to mix it up and throw a negative in there. So A is -3, B is 2 pi, C would be in parentheses, we don't have, and D is 2. So my amp is an absolute value of -3, which is 3. My period is 2 pi over 2 pi, which is 1. My phase shift is x equals c over b, which is still 0. And my vertical shift is y equals d, which is 2. Take your period and you divide it by 4. So we're starting at our 0 and we're adding 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, which is 1. Now this is sine. So we would start at 0 and A is negative. So instead of going up to our max, we're going to go to our minimum. Then back at 0. Then to our max. And then back at 0. And then we will take those points and shift them up 2. So here, 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 so it's at 3, so it should be at pi, and then here. So it'll look like that. Okay, so that's what happens when you have a vertical shift. And since it's y equals 2, you're going to notice y equals 2 is your midline, where your wave is still 3 units on each of those waves. Okay, the last thing I want to go over is if they give you the graph and you have to come up with an equation. Now, one thing about all of these graphs, there is no vertical shift and no horizontal shift, so no phase shift. So everything is starting at 0. So you're either going to use this equation or the cosine equation. And the easiest way to do this is, since we don't have a vertical shift and phase shift, our starting cycle is at 0. And you look to see and count the 5 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you figure out which of our create function graphs follows this pattern. That it goes 0, max, 0, min, 0. And if you set the sine graph, then you are correct. So after you determine, because remember cosine will go max 0, min 0, max. So that's how you know the difference. After you figure out which equation, then your job is to find A and B. Well, A is the amplitude, is how high or how low your graph went. So we can go ahead and look at a graph and see that the max was 4, the min was -4. So A had to be 4, and it's positive because it went to the maximum first. Now, all we have to do is find B. The way that you do that, remember 2 pi over B represented your period. So to solve for B, all you have to do is do 2 pi divided by your period would give you B. So we have to figure out what our period was. So find out where they started. Start at 0, ended at pi over 2. So that distance is pi over 2. So you're going to do 2 pi divided by pi over 2, which is the same thing as 2 pi times 2 over pi, which is equal to, these cancel, 4. So B is 4. And there's your equation. Okay, so to find B, you always do 2 pi over your period. And anytime you have to divide by a fraction, remember you do keep, change, flip. And that's it.